friends, welcome back to my channel. Today in WebLogic class, we are going to learn about the clusters. So we will see the cluster overview, cluster creation, and the cluster configuration. And after these sessions, we would be able to describe two cluster architecture, basic and multi-tier, create and configure a cluster, and create and configure the dynamic cluster. So let's understand the cluster. So cluster is a logical group of managed server from the same domain that run cooperatively. And cluster support features that provide high availability for web application, web services, EJB, and JMS. Also, cluster is a transparent to its client and it can have a servers added to it statically or a dynamically. If we are creating a static cluster, so we can statically add or manually add the servers. If we are creating a dynamic cluster, so based on the configuration, the minimum number of servers or maximum number of uh, managed servers we define, based on that, the number of managed server would be added in a cluster. Also, cluster require a cluster proxy to provide load balancing if it is host web application. So when we created a cluster and cluster load balancing can be happen, uh, that is possible by a cluster proxy. So cluster proxy is nothing, it's a plugin file, and that can route the traffic or it is used to integrate the web server and the app servers. Let's understand the benefits of clustering. So clustering basically provide the scalability. More capacity for application can be provided by adding servers without interruption of services or making architecture changes. Also, clustering can provide a load balancing, so traffic would be distributed across the members of a clusters. Okay, and cluster also have a benefit of failover. When a server fails, another one can automatically take its place. And next benefit of clustering is the migration. When a server fails, its spine services can continue by moving them to another server in the cluster or by moving the entire failed server to a new hardware. A spine service is a service that must run only on a single instance of WebLogic server at any given time. Okay, so now let's understand the basic cluster architecture. So suppose we have a one machine and we want to create a one cluster, and cluster can be created vertically or horizontally. If we are creating a cluster vertically, we can create a cluster in a single machine. If we are creating a horizontal cluster, we need at least two machines. So let's understand this cluster architecture where we have a two machines, machine one and machine two, and there we have created a one cluster, and that cluster is having four managed servers, server one, server two, and server 3 and server 4. If you see the server 1 and server 2 in a machine 1 and server 3 and server 4 in a machine 2. Okay. So the traffic coming to the cluster or cluster members called the managed servers from the cluster proxy. So cluster proxy would work as a uh, plugin to distribute the traffic or to route the traffic to a respective managed server from the clients. Client here we can see it can be a web server or it can be a load balancer. And here we have a multi-tier cluster architecture where we will see there is a application which has your web server or web component in a one cluster or your backend code or EJB code in your backend cluster or another cluster. So we can define when we are creating our architecture represent where we have our front-end application or web app code in a cluster, in a separate cluster, and our EJB code or we can say our backend code or backend services running in a separate cluster. And both web application calling if the backend services or EJP code from the application, so they can call the clusters or backend cluster. Okay, so here we'll discuss the architecture advantage and disadvantage. So basic and we can say single tier architecture is easier to administer as we have seen. There is a single cluster we can create for both web application and EJB application, and it is less network traffic and EJB calls are local, so therefore it is faster. And if you talk about the disadvantage of basic single tier, so it cannot load balance the EJB calls as we have seen it. And multi-tier is a clustering provide some more advantage like EJB calls are load balanced. Okay, since we have a separate cluster for EJB code, so we can easily load balance the EJB calls, and scaling options also is provided. For example, you can set or add hardware and WebLogic server instance to whichever tier is busier, whether it's EJB code we want to scale up or scale down, or the web code we want to scale up or scale down. So that we can plan easily. It also provide more security option. For example, you could place a firewall in between the web application tier and the EJB tier, but the EJB calls would be quite slow since the EJB code or EJB tier is running in a separate cluster. If you put the firewall, then it will create a performance challenge as well. So all these things we need to keep in mind. The disadvantage of this kind of cluster is it is harder to administer, perhaps more hardware and licensing cost required. EGB calls are remote, so therefore it is quite slow. More network traffic. So how the cluster communicates with its members? So cluster members communicate with each other in two ways. One to many messages or peer-to-peer messages. One to many messages are periodically had to be to indicate continued availability. Okay, to announce the availability of a cluster services. So this communication can use either of the following: unicast and a multicast. So unicast, no additional configuration is required, but when we choose the multicast, the network configuration or hardware configuration is required. So when we create a cluster, we will see the messaging types here. Which messaging type option we are going to choose, whether unicast or a multicast. So peer-to-peer message is different. It is basically used when we are creating a replicating or session replication. So for creating or for replicating a HTTP session and a stateful session, so we can create a peer-to-peer messages to access cluster objects that reside on a remote server or multi-tier architecture. Then case also we can create a peer-to-peer messages. This communication uses sockets. So most of the time we basically use the unicast, and unicast is the recommended and the quite efficient messaging tool to communicate to its members of a cluster. Multicast basically used where a large number of members there in a one cluster. So let's understand this thing. Then we'll also do the demo where we'll create a cluster, static cluster and dynamic cluster. So we can understand like how we can create a cluster, or we can configure the cluster using the configuration wizard. So when we are creating a domain, that time also we can create a cluster. So in this configuration wizard, add cluster and assign manage server to them. So this is very simple. When we are creating domain, that time we also have the option. But after creating a domain, we can also create the clusters. We can go to the administration server and click on under the environment, there is option cluster, and after clicking on the clusters, we will can also create a cluster. And there are options we will choose when we create a new cluster, whether we want to create a new static cluster or a cluster, or we want to create a dynamic cluster. Okay, and this is how we can add the servers to the cluster. If we have created a static cluster, then we can add the manage server to the cluster, that is called the member of the cluster. So either we can add the existing server to the cluster, or we can create a new server and add to this cluster. So this is how we can add the manage server. Or if we have created dynamic cluster, so we define the configuration, the minimum number of cluster automatically would be added into the cluster. So dynamic cluster basically is created using the server template. So when we create a dynamic cluster, first we create a server template. If it is already not there, when we are creating a dynamic cluster, so server template is created. Our existing server template, if it is already there, we can use it. So server template basically defines common server attributes. Okay. So based on that template, dynamic cluster and the managed server would be created into the cluster. And a server template define, as I told you, the server attribute. So server based on that template share those attributes. If you change any attribute in the template, all of the servers based on that template would change. Okay. And a cluster can be associated with one server template. The cluster set the number of dynamic servers needed. Okay. So when we set the number of dynamic servers needed or minimum number of dynamic, the cluster create those number of dynamic servers. That number of servers is generated and assigned to the cluster. These servers show in the servers table with the type dynamic as opposed to configure. So we will see this thing when we create a dynamic cluster. So here is also we can see how we can create a dynamic cluster. So for creating a dynamic cluster, first go to the console, log in it, and click on log and edit. Then you can go inside the environment and there is a cluster option. So when we click on the cluster, we can see the new button is there. So we click on the new, we will find two options, cluster or dynamic cluster. So this time let's choose the dynamic cluster. And when we choose the dynamic cluster, let's click on the next. And here we, before clicking next, we can see the name of the cluster, what the name you want to define for a cluster, and the messaging mode. So messaging mode here we can choose the unicast, and if you are choosing the unicast, no extra configuration needed, and not we are even not defining the any channel. So default channel it will use. Then once we click next, we will see the properties of dynamic servers. Then we can see the number of dynamic servers we want to create or server name prefix. Okay, then after defining all these properties, then we can click on next. Then we specify the machine binding, how you want to bind this managed server to a machine. So use any machine configuration in its domain, or use a single machine for all dynamic servers if you have a single machine. So all dynamic servers would be binded to a particular machine. Or we can also use a subset of machine in this domain where we can provide the match expression of our machine, and accordingly the server would be binded to a particular machine when this dynamic server is created. So the machine calculation and the dynamic server calculation automatically done by the WebLogic. And if we click in next, we will see assign each dynamic server. specify the listen port binding, and there are also two options we can have. The first option say assign each dynamic server unique listen port, or we can also have a fixed listen port. So once we have a unique listen port, so we need to provide a base listen ports. So base listen port, suppose we are providing 7100. So we have a two managed server. So uh, managed server would be allocated port like 7101, 7102. And if we are providing or we are choosing a fixed listen port, so the whatever ports we define here, the port would be allocated to the managed server. And then we can click finish and activate the changes. And this is how dynamic cluster created, and the number of managed server as we defined would also be created, and we can see in a list of the servers. Here I have my WebLogic running, and I have logged in into the WebLogic, and now I'm going to create the cluster. I'll create a cluster in static and a dynamic both way, and we will see the demo part here. Okay, so inside the environment there is a cluster, and let me click on the cluster. And first, let me click on lock and edit so I can get this admin console in editable mode. Okay, so now I can see the new button is open. So here, once we click on the new, I can see the cluster or dynamic cluster. Okay, so let me create a static cluster first. So here I'm going to create a static cluster, and the option I can see here, the cluster properties, what I want to define. It means we can choose the cluster name, cluster static, or let me see the static cluster. Okay, yeah, static cluster, and I'll see static cluster one. And messaging mode, here we have unicast and multicast. But as I told you, unicast is not required any extra configuration, but when we choose the multicast, it would require hardware and network configuration. So this time we are going with the multicast only. Let's click on OK, and the cluster is created. That's it. So once the cluster is created, we can go into the cluster, and we have the configuration tab or configuration page of the cluster. There, let's go to the servers, and inside that servers, we can see the option to add the servers in this one. So either we can add the existing servers, or we can create a new server. Since I do not have any existing server, so I'm going to create a server one. Okay, so let me define this static ms1, and listen address. We are creating on the same server. We can keep this link, or we can provide the IP address, or we can see the local host. Okay, so all this details should be handy and calculated before. How we want to set the local host and the port, what port we want to choose for particular managed server in a cluster. Okay, so let me click finish. I can see here one managed server is created, and you can see the post. Okay, so let me click on activate changes so I can see changes would be written in a configuration and roll out to the server. Now I'll go on the server. Here I can see the server list. The static MS1 is created, and it is part of a cluster static cluster one. Okay. And again, let me click on lock and edit. This time I'm going to create another managed server. Okay. It, it static MS2 port number this. and localhost. And while I'm creating a managed server, also if give the option whether you want to add this server to a cluster or not. If no, this is a standalone server you can create. If you want to add this server, yes, make this server member of existing cluster. You can choose the static the cluster name, and if you want to create a separate cluster for this managed server, we can choose the option yes, create a new cluster for this option. So this time I'm going to choose yes, make this server a member of the existing cluster. So let me click next and finish. So here we can see the many servers that I added. I can add by going inside the cluster and adding the many server, or we can add that managed server while creating a managed server itself. So now for for performing any action like start stop, so I need to add this managed server in a machine. So I'll go to the environment again and I'll go to the machine. I'll create a machine one. Okay. I can see the machine is already created. So I'll go to the inside machine and go to the servers. And here I'll add all those managed server in the machine. Okay. So these managed server are part of the machine one now. Yeah. These managed server are part of the machine now, and I'll go and activate the changes. Okay, so again, let me go to the servers, and here also we can see the particular server is the type, it is configured, right? And if it is a part of the cluster, and if it is binded to a particular machine, so machine name and the state, health, and listen port. Also, if you want to see more properties of the servers, we can customize this table as well. We have lots of options here. You can choose required option and add it. If you want to see how many sockets been opened by this managed server, you can see. If you want to see the SSL listen port enable or not, you can choose this option. Or you want to see the listen address as well. So that option also choose and drop to the right side and apply. So we will see the more property has been added and we can review it accordingly. Okay, guys. So now the static cluster creation we have seen, and we are able to create a static cluster, added managed server. Let me try to start the managed server if I would be able to. And okay, choose. Let us start one managed server once. Okay, yes, I can see the option. Since my machine is already running, so I'm getting this option. And I can see the managed server one is going to start. Okay. Okay, so let's get started. It is in starting mode. So once it is started, we would be able to access this managed server. And now let me go with the dynamic cluster. So let's click on the clusters again and let me click on lock and edit. Okay, now I'm getting this option new. Select cluster, dynamic cluster. Let me create a dynamic cluster this time. And here I can get the properties which we need to define, like the cluster name. Let me define the cluster name. Cluster one. Let me define this dynamic. Okay, dynamic cluster 1 and messaging mode. This time also I'm going to choose unicast and click next. Once I click next, here I'll see the dynamic server properties like dynamic server cluster size. Suppose we want the minimum number of clusters should be there in this cluster, so we can define two. If we want to increase, we can increase the numbers here. And maximum dynamic cluster size, suppose we can define, and in my case, I'm going to define four. Maximum dynamic server can be created in this cluster. And server name prefix, I can choose dynamic cluster 1 and let me choose MS1. So this is the prefix I'm going. Then the managed server would created. So managed server will be calculated based on the server name prefix. So managed server name would be like dynamic cluster 1 MS1 or MS2. And here we can see whether we want to create a new server template using the domain default or clone the existing server template for this cluster. So this time I having one server cluster that is a cluster one template, or I can also use a or create a new server template using the default domain template. Okay, so let me go with this one. Clicking next, we can specify the machine binding, and here we have a three option: use any machine configured in this domain, or use a single machine for all dynamic server, and the last uses subset of machine in this domain. So here, like we have a multiple machine, we choose use any machine configure in this domain. So randomly or the cluster calculation has happened. It's choose a machine. Like we have a suppose two or three machines associated or part of this domain. So the managed server would be created like one managed server would created machine one, second managed server would be binded to machine two, and third managed server would be binded to a machine third accordingly. And also we have option if you want to create all the dynamic server in a particular machine, so we can choose that machine name here, or you have a some machine name you want to provide give some machine expression, so you can choose a subset of machine in this domain. So you can provide that match expression. Like in my case, I have uh, machine hyphen one. That is the machine name. So I'll provide the machine and after that, whatever the name or company name is there, it will choose and bind the managed server to this machine. Whether I have machine one, machine two, or machine three, it will calculate and binds the managed server accordingly. So this time I'm going to use any machine configure in this domain. Since I have only one machine, so it will use the machine one only. And let me click next. Each dynamic server unique listen ports. So here we can specify the listen ports binding. So here also we have two options. One is dynamic server unique listen port or a dynamic server fixed listen ports. So dynamic server listen unique ports. Basically, we are providing here the base listen ports. We have a suppose we have two managed server. So the managed server would be allocated. The port would be allocated to managed server like 7101, 7102 accordingly. And if we are providing a fixed listen port, so it will use the whatever port we are giving here. So when we have a horizontal clustering, right? Horizontal clustering. Suppose we have two domains, a part of, two machine part of one domain, and we want to create a horizontal cluster. So that case we can use the fixed listen port here, and like 7101 would be allocated to manage server one. 7100 also would be allocated to manage server two, and both managed server would be created in separate machine, not on a single machine. Okay, let's click next, and we can review the cluster configuration here, and let's click on the finish. Okay, so here we can see dynamic cluster is created. Okay, and cluster messaging mode unique cast and migration based database and all the properties we can review here. And we can see there is no server is added yet to this cluster, but once we'll activate the changes, servers would be created. Here also in server list, we can see there is no servers created. Let me click on activate changes and see the server created or not. Oh, yes, we can see the dynamic server is created and the type we can see is dynamic. Okay, so we see the server name is calculated and created based on the template we have defined. And this part of the cluster, and this is binded to the machine one and the state and rest property we can see here. Okay, so if we go to the cluster again, we will see the servers added to the cluster. And if you go to the machine, and we will see the servers automatically added to the machine as well. So we have not done this manually. In static, like we have added the server to machine one, we have added server to the cluster. But in dynamic clustering, many servers added and always would keep or minimum many server it will keep two as we have defined two many server. Okay, so now go to the servers, and if I try to start the many server, I would be able to start. Let me try. Yeah, it's going to start. You can see the starting mode. And last time we have started static MS1, so it is running now. You can see here. Okay, so this is how we can create a dynamic cluster. We can see how the dynamic ma- managed servers are created and added to the dynamic cluster, and how it is binded to the machine, how the port is allocated to them. Okay, so based on the template, we can see the server template also. So we have seen like there a template is also created, dynamic cluster one MS1 template, and this template we can use for create more dynamic cluster. And if you want to change anything in the template, that will be reflected to all the managed server. If you want to change anything on the dynamic cluster template, just click on edit, and any property you want to change here, so it would be reflected to all the managed server. Okay, and to change the logging, so logging field would be updated to all servers. Let me try to update the logging. Here I have a 5,000 bytes. Let me make it 50,000 kilobytes file size for the log. And let me click rotate log file on the start this one property. I have updated this in a template. Okay. Yeah. And let me save and let me edit. Okay. Now let me go to the servers and it's on the dynamic cluster. And here after clicking dynamic cluster, we can see only two options. Two tabs are there, monitoring and control. Monitoring, we can check the health of the servers and all. But similarly, if we click on the static cluster or static to manage server, we will see the configurations tab as well. So there are configuration tab, protocol, and logging tab, and all other configuration tabs we can see. Okay, so why this dynamic managed server is having only two tabs there? If we click on any of the dynamic managed server, we'll see only two tabs, monitoring control. If you want to do the configuration, then how we can do? If you want to change any configuration for this particular managed server, heap size, logging details, and all. So for making any changes on managed server of the dynamic cluster or dynamic managed server, so we can do this thing in from the server template. So inside the cluster, we have created a server template, and this is the template we are using for the managed server. So here we can see all the configuration tab. We can change any property here would be reflected to all the managed server. So like I have changed the logging configuration here. So from default file size to I change this one. So it will be reflected to all the managed server. Okay, if I update any property, so this property would be updated to all the managed servers as well. So if you want to update any configuration on the managed server or on the dynamic managed server, so we can change it from the server template. And let me save and click activate change. So this is how we can update the properties of dynamic managed server as well.